This is breaking news.
And this is Jim Smith in Chopper 2. We are live overhead Columbia University ahead of a 2 o'clock p.m. deadline issued by the university today for the ongoing encampment. Protesters in the lawn area to disperse from the area. As we go in for a closer look, we can see a crowd has gathered just outside of that lawn area. Numerous people gathered along those walkways. We've been following for well over the last week the encampment that has been ongoing. Again, the school had issued a 2 o'clock deadline this afternoon for students that had been camping out to disperse. It's unclear at this time what or if anything will happen at 2 o'clock, and whether this will just be a situation where those students who have not dispersed will not remain in good standing with the university, or if there are imminent plans to have protesters removed in coordination with the NYPD. Again, that is not known at this time. Again, a closer look at the crowds that have gathered here, protesters, and the encampment still set up. By and large, most of the scene has remained the same for the better part of the last week, with all of those tents set up in that lawn area. We do want to mention there is a smaller crowd of protesters just outside of the university along Broadway. Last week, it was there was a system set up where anybody not a student was not being permitted onto the campus. That does appear what we have again today is a smaller group of protesters being held outside of the university gates along Broadway. Again, we will continue to monitor the situation again to see what or if anything happens once that 2 o'clock deadline passes. Again, Columbia University issuing a 2 o'clock p.m. deadline today for the encampment to be dispersed. Any students that had been camping out, setting up tents for the better part of the last week were issued a deadline to remove their items. We're watching now as some of the protesters do appear to be on the move. We'll monitor this situation and see if this entire crowd leaves the area as one unit, or this is a smaller group that has decided to break off from the larger group. And again, we are following events at Columbia University ahead of a 2 o'clock p.m. deadline for those students who had been camping out for the better part of the last week to break down the encampment, remove their tents, any personal items from the lawn area. The school had issued a 2 o'clock deadline today that is just coming up in a few minutes. Unknown at this time what or if anything will happen at 2 o'clock, whether there will be a planned removal of the encampment, whether those students that remain will just simply not be in good standing with the university. And just in the last few minutes, last minute or two, we did see a number of these protesters break off in that larger group that was assembled on the walkway. Again, we're following to see if this is going to be a situation where they process out of the area and conduct a march elsewhere. Are they going to remain within the grounds of the university, perhaps start to break down that encampment as we approach that 2 o'clock deadline? We'll continue to follow the situation, monitor everything that goes here. We also have crews on the ground as well, and we will keep you updated as the events unfold. And once again, we are monitoring the events. Columbia University. The university had issued a 2 o'clock deadline today for those that have been camped out for the past week to break down their encampment. From the lawn area, as we arrived a few minutes ago, we saw a large crowd that had assembled on the walkways just outside of the lawn area. And in the last few minutes, we did watch as this group started to march. Now, this time it appears they're just simply marching around that lawn area. We have not seen this group as a whole leave the general area. Unclear what their intentions are at this time. It's also unclear whether, if or what may happen at 2 o'clock, if there is a planned, coordinated system to remove the encampment at 2 o'clock or shortly thereafter, or simply the students that remain will not remain in good standing with the university. There's also a smaller group of protesters just outside the gates of the university along Broadway. For the last week, those that were not students were not permitted to enter the campus, so that has typically been the situation where protesters outside of the gates were not being let in simply because they were not members of the university. Again, we've been watching as that large group started to march around the perimeter of the lawn area, and at this time we're waiting to see if they plan on staying in the same general area, whether any of them plan on breaking down their encampments. And we'll continue to follow the situation here as that 2 o'clock deadline passes, and we'll keep you updated on the events as they unfold here at Columbia University. Okay, switch it over.
This has been breaking news. This is breaking news.
And we are still following the events at Columbia University. Protesters who had camped out for the better part of the last week or so had been issued a 2 o'clock deadline to disperse the encampment. That time has come and gone. Now, earlier, just before 2 o'clock, we did see a very large crowd that had assembled on the walkways and the steps just outside the lawn area where the tents have been set up for the last week. About 20 minutes ago, we did see the group start to march. It appears most of them have basically been marching around the perimeter of the lawn areas, as well as that area where the tents have been set up. It's unclear what the plans are for the protesters in terms of whether they plan on marching anywhere outside of this immediate area. Some of the people that we did see going around did seem to disperse, but the group as a whole overall has basically been marching the perimeter of the lawn areas, many of them here as well along those walkways and steps just outside of the lawn area. It was unclear what was to happen at 2 o'clock in terms of the university, whether it was a deadline in order for students to remain in good standing, perhaps not face disciplinary issues, or whether there is a plan to have the protesters as well as the encampment area removed. We've been following the situation to monitor the events here at this time. Again, a large crowd had assembled on the lawn area, and about 20 minutes ago, just after 2 o'clock, started to march around the perimeter of the encampment. There is also a smaller group outside the gates of the university. Pretty much during the entire time of this protest, the school have been trying to limit anybody inside the gates to students only, keeping non-students outside of the property of the school along Broadway near 116th Street. Again, a much smaller group that we can see over there as well. We'll continue to follow the situation here at Columbia University. Again, a large group that had assembled just outside of the encampment area on the lawn began a march just after 2 o'clock this afternoon, just after that deadline issued by the university to disperse from the encampment area. Unclear at this time what the group's plans are in terms of whether they continue to march around the immediate area, if they plan on marching to other portions of the university, or just simply marching around and reassembling again on that step area. And if you're just joining us again, we are following the events at Columbia University. The school had issued a 2 o'clock deadline for the protesters that had set up this area with the tents to remove their items and disperse from that lawn area. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a large crowd that had assembled on the walkways and steps just outside the lawn area began to march around essentially the perimeter of the two lawns, especially the one with the tents which have been set up for the past week. It's unclear at this time whether they're simply marching around the perimeter of that area where they've been occupying for the last week or so, or if there's plans to bring this march somewhere else on the campus or elsewhere. Again, we're waiting to find out what the consequences will be for those students that did not disperse, break down their personal belongings by 2 o'clock in terms of the university, and whether there'll be an organized effort anytime soon to have them removed. just joining us, we are following the events at Columbia University. The university had issued a 2 o'clock deadline today for the protesters that had been assembled for the last week and set up tents in one of the lawn areas on campus. The school had issued a 2 o'clock deadline to disperse, remove their belongings from that area. That deadline has passed now. Shortly after 2 o'clock, a large crowd which was assembled on the steps and walkways just outside of that area which has the tents began to march around the perimeter of the lawns, and we've been following them. Some of the people that have been marching seem to have just dispersed into other areas of campus, but the group as a whole continues to go around the perimeter of those lawn areas. It's unknown at this time whether they have plans to march elsewhere or just simply around the immediate area where the protests have been set up for the last week. It's still not known what the school's next steps will be in terms of that deadline, whether the disciplinary issues for the students that did not disperse or if there are more immediate plans to have the protesters move. We're now watching, as it does appear, a larger group out of the main group starting to make its way off into another section of campus. Again, earlier, many of them seem to have just been walking around the perimeter of that lawn area where the tents have been set up. Now seeing some of them start to break off into different sections of the campus. Continuing to follow the situation at Columbia University. University had given a 2 o'clock deadline this afternoon. Protesters, which had set up this encampment for the last week, to disperse, remove their belongings, remove the tents, and leave that area. That 2 o'clock deadline has now passed. There was a large crowd which had assembled on the walkways and steps just outside of the lawn, and shortly after that 2 o'clock deadline, we saw that group start to march around the perimeter of the lawns. They have now fanned out around some of the adjoining plazas near the lawn. It's unclear if they have intentions to march anywhere specific on campus or to just stay in the general vicinity of the lawn area where those tents have been set up. We have seen no signs at this point, any imminent signs of the tents being removed by the university. It's unknown what their immediate plans are with that deadline passing, if there were clear plans to have the tents removed shortly thereafter, or whether that 2 o'clock deadline would be more of a disciplinary item for the students that were involved. There's also a small group outside the gates of the university, Broadway near 116th Street. Last week, while these protests have been going on, the school has limited anybody inside the campus to students, so trying to keep outside protesters outside the property of the school. Again, a 2 o'clock deadline imposed by Columbia University has now passed. The protesters, which had assembled just outside of the tent area, started to march just after 2 o'clock. We have been watching them now as they made their way around the perimeter of the lawns through some of the other plazas here at the university. During the course of that march, everything has appeared, at least from our vantage point, to be peaceful. We have not seen any physical interactions with the group marching around the campus. And again, no clear signs on when the tents will be removed by the university, if that will be anything imminent. Just joining us here at CBS New York, we are following the events at Columbia University. Protests and an encampment that have been set up for the last week were given a 2 o'clock deadline today to remove their belongings, break down those tents, and disperse from the area. The protesters, which had been here for the better part of the last week, and possibly more joining them, had assembled in the area just outside of the lawn, the walkways and stairwell here. Shortly after 2 o'clock, as that deadline passed, the group started to march around the perimeter of the lawns. They have expanded their march area to go just outside of some of the plazas that surround the lawn. It's not known at this time whether they will continue to march to other portions of the campus or just stay in the general area where the encampment has been for the last week. And as we mentioned earlier, it's still unclear from the university standpoint, or at least what they have made public, what that 2 o'clock deadline will entail, if it's just mere disciplinary issues at this point, or whether there is a more immediate plan to have the tents removed. And as we're getting overhead Broadway, we can give you a quick quick glimpse of the protesters that have assembled outside of the university. Again, for the last week, the school had limited anybody coming in the gates to students, trying to keep outside protesters outside of the property of the school. There we can see them set up along Broadway. We have seen no immediate plans involving the NYPD. There have been police in the area since these protests started about a week and a half ago, with the original encampment that was set up on this area of lawn. That was taken down within 2 days, and a few days later, this larger encampment was set up on the adjacent lawn area. Again, we'll continue to follow the situation at Columbia University and update you as the events unfold. Once again, if you're just joining us on CBS New York, we're following the events at Columbia University. The university had imposed a 2 p.m. deadline today for protesters that had set up the tents, the encampment for the last week, to remove their belongings, disperse from the area, the lawn area that has been used for the last week. Just after 2 o'clock, the large group which had assembled just outside of the lawn began a march around the perimeter of the lawn area that has expanded into some of the surrounding plazas. And there, as you go in for a look, you can see those protesters still making their way around the campus. We've been waiting to find out more information as to what that 2 o'clock deadline will mean in terms of disciplinary action, or if there is a more immediate plan to have the tents removed and protesters dispersed from those lawn areas. We can also tell you that there has been a smaller group just outside of the gates of the university. Last week, the school has limited protesters inside the property of the school to students only, trying to keep outside protesters along Broadway. And again, there is a smaller group that has assembled along Broadway. From what we have seen from the air, though, the protests appear to have been orderly. We have not seen any incidents or altercations ongoing, at least from our vantage point. As well, we have not seen any indicators from overhead that there is an imminent plan to have those tents removed. Again, though, we are waiting to find out more information from the university if they will make those plans public. Continue to follow the situation at Columbia University again as the protest ongoing now over a week, continue this afternoon with that 2 o'clock deadline now passed to break down this encampment area. are continuing our coverage of the events at Columbia University. A 2 o'clock deadline to remove the tents and other items that have been set up in this encampment on one of the lawn areas. That 2 o'clock deadline imposed by the university has now passed. There was a large crowd of protesters which had assembled on some of the walkways adjacent to the lawn area. And as that 2 o'clock deadline passed, shortly after 2 o'clock, that group began to march around the central perimeter of the lawns. They've expanded out in some of the adjoining plazas as well, but for the most part, keeping this march to the general vicinity of the lawn areas and, of course, those tents which have been set up for the last week. The protesters, as they've made their way around the campus, from our vantage point, we have not seen any incidents, altercations. It appears to have been relatively calm, at least from a physical standpoint. It's unknown at this time whether that 2 o'clock deadline is just a mere disciplinary deadline or if there is a more imminent plan to have the tents removed, any protesters as well removed from that lawn area. That is unclear at this time. We have seen no visible signs from high above that might be happening imminently, and of course at this time the school has not released any details on what the next steps may be. As well, from the protesters' standpoint, we have not been able to receive information whether these march will continue, if there are plans on the protester side to remove the tents in the near future. We will continue to follow the situation. Again, a 2 o'clock deadline imposed by Columbia University has now passed. The encampment area that we have seen set up on one of the lawn areas for the last week remains intact. We are not noticing any reduction in the number of tents that have been set up. It appears to basically be the same as it has been for the last week. So of course we will monitor the situation here. We also have crews that will be covering other angles of the story later in the day. And for now, we'll just monitor the situation at Columbia University as these protesters make their way around the campus. And we are continuing to follow the events live at Columbia University. The school had imposed a 2 o'clock p.m. deadline today for the protesters and encampment that has been set up for the last week to remove their belongings, break down those tents, and disperse from the lawn area that they have been set up on for the last week. A large group had assembled on some of the walkways just outside of the lawn area, and as that 2 o'clock deadline passed, the group has essentially been marching around the general perimeter of the lawns as well as some of the adjacent plaza area. We have been watching as the protesters, at least from our vantage point, appear to have been orderly. We have not noticed any incidents as they have made their way around the campus. There is also a much smaller group just outside the gates of the school along Broadway. That, of course, is something that we have seen also for the last week, where protesters that were not students had assembled outside the gates of the school, keeping anybody that is not a student outside the gates for the last week now that we've been following this situation. Again, it's unclear what that 2 o'clock deadline will mean for the short term and the long term, if that was just a disciplinary deadline for any students that did not leave, may not remain in good standing, or other disciplinary issues and what the short or long-term plan is by the school to have this tent area removed. You may remember it was about a week and a half ago. There was a smaller area which had been set up on the adjoining lawn. That was removed within about a day or so of being set up. And a few days later, just about a week ago, a much larger encampment set up on the adjoining lawn area. That is what we've been watching for the last week. This encampment, protesters, and the school today imposing a deadline at 2 o'clock for this encampment to be broken down. That deadline has now passed, and we are waiting to find out what the next few hours will hold for the protesters, the encampment, as well as the school, as well as the days going forward. We will continue to follow the situation. We have other reporters working the story. We'll have more on this ongoing situation at Columbia University on CBS 2 News at 5 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. For now, I'm Jim Smith in Chopper 2.
This has been breaking news.